The Oskar Dirlewanger Brigade occupies a unique and deeply disturbing place in the history of the Second World War. Even within the already brutal structure of the Waffen-SS, this unit stood apart for its lawlessness, criminal makeup, and the scale of violence it unleashed on civilian populations. Its reputation was not the result of battlefield effectiveness or military discipline, but of systematic terror, mass murder, and the deliberate erosion of any boundary between warfare and crime. To understand how such a formation came into existence, it is necessary to begin with the man whose name it carried, Oskar Dirlewanger. Born in 1895 in the Kingdom of Württemberg, Dirlewanger's early life appeared outwardly unremarkable. He came from a stable middle-class background and followed a conventional path into military service, joining the German army before the First World War. Like many of his generation, the war shaped his worldview profoundly, exposing him to extreme violence, instability, and ideological radicalization. During the First World War, Dirlewanger served on both the Western and Eastern fronts. His time in the East coincided with the collapse of the Russian Empire, a period marked by chaos, shifting fronts, and the breakdown of traditional authority. For many German soldiers, the Eastern Front reinforced racialized and dehumanizing views of Slavic populations. These experiences would later inform Dirlewanger's attitudes toward civilians and partisans in occupied territories. When Germany collapsed in 1918, Dirlewanger did not quietly demobilize. Instead, he returned home through irregular means, gathering other soldiers along the way and leading them back to Germany outside formal surrender arrangements. This episode demonstrated early traits that would define his later career: independence, disregard for authority, and a willingness to operate beyond legal constraints when it suited him. 4. Whether added another enemy. Cold rain soaked uniforms and equipment, mud-slowed movement, and exhausted soldiers already carrying heavy loads. Wet conditions affected weapons, visibility, and morale. Nights were cold and sleepless, days tense and unpredictable. Under such conditions, even veteran units struggled to maintain effectiveness. It was within this harsh environment that Technical Sergeant Charles Haslett Coolidge served. Coolidge was 23 years old. He came from Signal Mountain, Tennessee, a quiet place far removed from the forests of France. He was not wealthy, famous, or politically connected. He was one of millions of Americans who entered the war not seeking glory, but answering a call that seemed unavoidable in a world at war. Within the Army, Coolidge was not an officer. He did not wear bars or stars. He was a non-commissioned officer, a category often described as the backbone of the Army. His role placed him between officers who issued orders and enlisted men who carried them out. In combat, NCOs frequently became the decisive leaders when plans collapsed and chaos replaced structure. Coolidge served as a heavy weapons non-commissioned officer in the 141st Infantry Regiment. His primary responsibility was the operation and employment of machine guns. Yet the contradictions of the Nazi system soon worked in his favor. Through political connections and the intervention of powerful patrons, Dirlewanger was gradually rehabilitated. His service in the Spanish Civil War with German forces supporting Franco allowed him to reestablish his credentials as a combat veteran and ideological loyalist, despite ongoing concerns about his conduct and character. By the outbreak of the Second World War, Heinrich Himmler and other SS leaders faced a growing manpower problem. At the same time, they were developing increasingly radical approaches to occupation and security warfare, in Eastern Europe. It was within this context that Dirlewanger found his opportunity. The SS leadership authorized the creation of a special unit composed of convicted poachers, criminals, and later concentration camp inmates, men considered unsuitable for regular military service, but deemed useful for brutal counterinsurgency operations. Dirlewanger was placed in command of this experimental formation. Initially small, the unit was justified under the premise that experienced hunters would be effective against partisans. In reality, the selection criteria prioritized violent backgrounds and a willingness to operate without restraint. From the outset, the unit functioned outside normal military discipline, answering directly to SS and police authorities rather than army command structures. This was the foundation of what would become known as the Dirlewanger Brigade, a force created not to fight conventional battles, but to terrorize, punish, and destroy populations labeled as enemies of the Reich. Its origins reveal not an accident or anomaly, but a deliberate choice by the Nazi leadership to weaponize criminality in service of ideological warfare. By the time the unit was deployed to occupied Eastern Europe, the conditions were set for unprecedented brutality. The combination of a violent commander, a criminal rank and file, ideological dehumanization, and near-total impunity ensured that the Dirlewanger Brigade would become one of the most notorious formations of the Second World War. The deployment of the Dirlewanger unit to Belarus marked the moment when its purpose became unmistakably clear. This was not a battlefield in the conventional sense. There were no front lines, no large troop movements, and no decisive engagements. Instead, Belarus represented a space where Nazi ideology, occupation policy, and unrestrained violence fused into a single operational environment. Following Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Belarus fell under brutal occupation. The region's geography, dense forests, marshlands, and scattered rural settlements, made it difficult to control using traditional military methods. At the same time, German policies of exploitation, starvation, and racial persecution ensured widespread resistance. Soviet partisan groups emerged quickly, drawing support from local populations who had little incentive to cooperate with occupiers. German command responded not by addressing the causes of resistance, but by redefining the problem. Rather than seeing partisans as irregular combatants, Nazi authorities classified them as criminals and subhumans. This distinction was crucial. It removed any obligation to follow the laws of war. Civilians suspected of assisting partisans were no longer civilians at all. Entire villages could be labeled hostile entities, subject to destruction without investigation or restraint. This ideological framework created the conditions in which the Dirlewanger unit thrived. Originally formed as a small detachment of convicted poachers, the unit was justified on the theory that hunters would be effective in forest warfare. In practice, the unit quickly evolved into something far more dangerous. Recruitment standards collapsed. Criminal backgrounds were no longer an exception. They became the defining feature of the formation. By the time Dirlewanger's men arrived in Belarus, they were operating with near-total impunity. The unit was attached to SS and police commands conducting anti-bandit operations. These missions followed a standardized but devastating pattern. Villages were surrounded at dawn. Escape routes were sealed. The population was herded into central areas for screening. What followed was arbitrary and lethal. Able-bodied men were often separated and deported for forced labor in Germany. Women, children, the elderly, and the sick were frequently deemed useless. Many were shot on the spot. Others were locked into barns or houses that were then set on fire. Entire communities were erased in a matter of hours. Official reports describe these actions as successful engagements against partisans. The reality was starkly different. Post-war investigations, survivor testimonies, and even internal German documents revealed that the overwhelming majority of those killed were unarmed civilians. Weapon seizures were minimal or fabricated. Resistance, when it existed at all, was often limited to flight rather than combat. Yet these discrepancies had little impact on policy. German authorities prioritized numbers. Villages destroyed, suspects executed, laborers deported. These metrics were used to measure effectiveness. Dirlewanger's unit produced results that aligned perfectly with this bureaucratic logic, even as it violated every principle of military discipline. Looting became routine. Dirlewanger's men stripped villages of food, livestock, clothing, and valuables. Alcohol consumption during operations was common. Violence often escalated beyond any operational purpose, driven by sadism, boredom, or opportunism. Sexual violence was widespread, but rarely documented, as it fell outside even the regime's distorted reporting mechanisms. Complaints emerged from other German units stationed nearby. Regular Wehrmacht officers, and even some SS commanders reported that Dirlewanger's men were uncontrollable, poorly disciplined, and prone to excess. These complaints were not rooted in moral opposition, but in concern that indiscriminate violence undermined long-term control by driving more civilians into partisan ranks. Despite this, Dirlewanger himself was protected. He enjoyed the patronage of Heinrich Himmler, who viewed ruthless security warfare as both ideologically correct and strategically necessary. In Himmler's view, terror was not a failure of policy, it was the policy. Dirlewanger's willingness to operate without restraint made him valuable, regardless of the chaos he unleashed. As operations continued through 1942 and 1943, the unit expanded dramatically. New recruits were drawn from prisons, penal battalions, and eventually concentration camps. Many had histories of violent crime. Few had meaningful military training. What they shared was a status outside normal society, and an opportunity to escape punishment through service. This dynamic created a toxic incentive structure. Brutality was rewarded. Promotions were based on aggression rather than competence. Restraint was interpreted as weakness or disloyalty. Over time, the unit developed a culture in which violence was not merely permitted, but expected. The distinction between orders and personal impulse blurred. Villages were destroyed not only because they were suspected of aiding partisans, but because destruction itself became the goal. Fire consumed homes, crops, and infrastructure. Survivors were left homeless in hostile territory, effectively sentenced to death by exposure or starvation. The human cost was staggering. Entire districts of Belarus were depopulated. Tens of thousands were killed. The social fabric of rural life was shattered. Even German administrators acknowledged privately that large areas had become wastelands incapable of supporting further occupation or economic exploitation. Ironically, the anti-partisan campaign failed on its own terms. Rather than eliminating resistance, the violence intensified it. Survivors fled into forests, joining partisan units out of necessity rather than ideology. Each massacre generated new recruits for the resistance, perpetuating a cycle of violence that German forces could not control. When Dirlewanger's unit encountered actual armed resistance, its weaknesses became apparent. In engagements with organized partisan groups, casualties within the unit increased sharply. Poor discipline, lack of coordination, and minimal tactical training left Dirlewanger's men vulnerable. Their effectiveness depended almost entirely on overwhelming unarmed populations, not on defeating armed opponents. This contradiction did not lead to reform. Instead, German authorities doubled down. As the war situation deteriorated following defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, desperation replaced caution. Security forces were ordered to extract labor and suppress resistance at any cost. The future of the population was no longer a concern. By late 1943, the Dirlewanger unit had become a battalion-sized formation with a reputation that even other SS units found alarming. Reports described unchecked violence, internal disorder, and extreme psychological degradation among its members. Alcoholism, insubordination, and indiscriminate killing were endemic. Yet as long as villages burned and bodies accumulated, higher command remained satisfied. The campaign in Belarus revealed the true function of the unit. It was not designed to win battles. It was designed to destroy societies. The methods employed, mass executions, village burnings, collective punishment, were not excesses. They were integral to a system that treated entire populations as enemies. In this environment, atrocity became routine. Men who might once have hesitated learned quickly that violence carried no consequences. Over time, many ceased to distinguish between orders and desire. The unit no longer required direction to commit crimes. It functioned as a self-sustaining mechanism of terror. As Soviet forces prepared their massive counteroffensives in 1944, German control in Belarus began to collapse. The devastation left behind by security operations offered little strategic advantage. There were no loyal populations, no stable supply lines, no economic gains. What remained were ruins. The Dirlewanger unit, bloodied and disordered but still intact, was withdrawn westward. Its methods, forged in the forests of Belarus, would soon be unleashed again, this time not against remote villages, but against a major European capital. The transition would reveal the final and most infamous chapter of the unit's history. By the summer of 1944, the war had turned decisively against Nazi Germany. The Red Army was advancing rapidly from the east, German forces were retreating across multiple fronts, and the occupation regimes built on terror were beginning to collapse. It was within this atmosphere of desperation that the Dirlewanger unit was expanded and redeployed once again, this time into the heart of occupied Poland. The unit that entered Poland bore little resemblance to a conventional military formation. Years of service in Belarus had hardened its members into instruments of unrestrained violence, but had also eroded what little discipline they once possessed. Alcoholism, internal brutality, and disregard for command were widespread. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, the unit was expanded into a brigade-sized formation. This expansion was not driven by battlefield success. It was driven by ideological necessity. German authorities anticipated large-scale uprisings in occupied territories as Soviet forces approached. They needed units willing to employ extreme violence against civilian populations without hesitation. The Dirlewanger Brigade fit this requirement perfectly. Warsaw became the testing ground. On August 1, 1944, the Polish Home Army launched the Warsaw Uprising, a massive, coordinated effort to liberate the city before the arrival of Soviet forces. For the Polish resistance, the uprising represented a final assertion of sovereignty after years of occupation. For the German leadership, it was a direct challenge to authority that had to be crushed at any cost. Hitler ordered Warsaw destroyed. Responsibility for suppressing the uprising was handed to SS and police forces known for brutality rather than competence. Among them were the Dirlewanger Brigade and the SS Sturm Brigade under Heinz Reinfarth. Their mission was not merely to defeat armed resistance, but to terrorize the population into submission. The nature of combat in Warsaw was fundamentally different from the forests of Belarus. Warsaw was a densely populated urban center with hundreds of thousands of civilians trapped inside. Fighting took place building by building, street by street. Resistance fighters operated from apartments, cellars, and barricades. German forces faced snipers, ambushes, and improvised explosives. For disciplined units, this type of combat required coordination and restraint. For the Dirlewanger Brigade, it became an opportunity for unchecked violence. From the first days of deployment, the brigade engaged in systematic atrocities against civilians. Entire districts were subjected to mass executions. Men, women, and children were dragged from buildings and shot in courtyards, streets, and cellars. Hospitals were stormed. Medical staff and patients were killed indiscriminately. These actions were not spontaneous. They were encouraged by explicit orders that framed the entire population as complicit in rebellion. Civilians were no longer regarded as non-combatants. They were defined as enemies whose destruction would break resistance morale. The Walla district became the site of some of the worst massacres. Over the course of several days in early August, tens of thousands of civilians were murdered. The killings followed a grimly efficient pattern. Groups were assembled, machine guns positioned, and executions carried out continuously. Bodies were piled in streets and courtyards. Survivors were forced to burn the dead to prevent disease. Dirlewanger's men were among the primary perpetrators. Eyewitness accounts described soldiers intoxicated, laughing, and competing over acts of violence. Looting accompanied murder. Women were assaulted before being killed. Children were shot alongside their parents. There was no attempt to distinguish between fighters and civilians. The scale of violence shocked even some German officers. Reports from within the German command structure acknowledged that the brutality was counterproductive and chaotic. Yet no meaningful intervention occurred. The destruction of Warsaw had become an end in itself, aligned with Hitler's desire to erase the city as a symbol of Polish resistance. The Dirlewanger Brigade proved poorly suited for sustained urban combat. When faced with organized resistance units, its lack of discipline became a liability. Casualties mounted quickly. Officers struggled to maintain control. Friendly fire incidents were common. The brigade relied heavily on overwhelming firepower and terror rather than tactical coordination. Nevertheless, it continued to be used. The logic was simple. Even if the unit performed poorly militarily, it excelled at terror. Civilian casualties were not a regrettable side effect. They were the intended outcome. Entire neighborhoods were emptied through murder or forced evacuation. As the uprising dragged on, the city was systematically destroyed. Buildings were blown up after being cleared. Infrastructure was demolished. Cultural landmarks were reduced to rubble. The destruction served no immediate military purpose. It was a punitive act, designed to annihilate Warsaw as a living city. Dirlewanger's brigade participated fully in this process. By the time the uprising was crushed in October 1944, Warsaw lay in ruins. Approximately 200,000 civilians had been killed. Hundreds of thousands more were displaced. The city's population was forcibly expelled, and what remained was methodically destroyed. The Dirlewanger Brigade emerged from Warsaw with an even darker reputation. Its losses were heavy, particularly among officers. The brutality that defined its actions also undermined its effectiveness. The unit was increasingly unstable, held together more by fear and inertia than command cohesion. Yet rather than being disbanded, it was rewarded. Dirlewanger himself received promotions and decorations. The brigade was formally incorporated into the Waffen-SS structure, gaining a veneer of legitimacy it had never truly earned. This decision reflected the regime's priorities in its final phase. Loyalty and ruthlessness mattered more than competence or control. The Warsaw Uprising represented a turning point. For the Nazi regime, it marked the transition from occupation to annihilation as policy. For the Dirlewanger Brigade, it cemented its role as an instrument of mass murder on an unprecedented scale. The violence in Warsaw was not an aberration. It was the logical outcome of years of policy that normalized collective punishment, dehumanization, and the use of criminal violence as a tool of governance. The brigade did not invent these practices, it embodied them. As German forces retreated westward under Soviet pressure, the Dirlewanger Brigade followed. What remained of it was exhausted, bloodied, and increasingly unstable. Its ranks were filled with men hardened by atrocity and desensitized to human suffering. The final phase of the brigade's existence would unfold in Germany itself. There, stripped of ideological justifications tied to occupation, the unit would face conventional warfare, an arena for which it was disastrously unprepared. Its collapse would be as violent and chaotic as its rise. By late 1944, the strategic situation facing Nazi Germany had become irreversible. The Red Army was advancing rapidly from the east, Allied forces were pushing in from the west, and German command structures were fragmenting under the pressure of continuous defeat. The war had entered its final, chaotic phase, a period marked by desperation, improvisation, and collapse. It was into this environment that the Dirlewanger Brigade was redeployed. Unlike its previous assignments, the brigade was no longer being used primarily for occupation or repression. German forces were running out of manpower. Every available unit, regardless of quality or suitability, was thrown into frontline combat. The Dirlewanger Brigade, despite its criminal composition and poor record in conventional fighting, was now expected to function as a regular combat formation. This transition exposed the fundamental weakness of the unit. The brigade had been shaped by years of terror operations against civilians, not by sustained engagement with trained enemy forces. Its members lacked cohesive training, battlefield discipline, and trust in one another. Command authority was weak. Loyalty was based on fear rather than professionalism. When placed into defensive operations against advancing Soviet troops, these flaws became immediately apparent. The brigade was deployed in parts of Slovakia, Hungary, and later within Germany itself. In these regions, German forces attempted to slow the Soviet advance through a series of hastily organized defensive lines. The fighting was intense, mobile, and unforgiving. This was not the environment in which Dirlewanger's men thrived. Soviet units were experienced, well-armed, and supported by artillery and armor. Engagements were no longer one-sided. Casualties within the brigade rose sharply. Desertions increased. Entire subunits disintegrated under pressure. Reports from German commanders described the brigade as unreliable and difficult to control. In combat situations requiring coordination, holding ground, executing counterattacks, or conducting organized withdrawals, the unit performed poorly. Orders were ignored or misunderstood. Panic spread quickly once positions came under sustained attack. Officers struggled to maintain authority over men accustomed to operating without restraint. The brigade's earlier reputation for ruthlessness did not translate into battlefield effectiveness. In fact, it often had the opposite effect. Soviet forces, aware of the unit's role in atrocities, treated captured members harshly. There was little incentive for surrender on either side. This further intensified the brutality of engagements and increased losses. As German territory came under direct threat, the ideological framework that had justified the brigade's existence began to collapse. There were no longer occupied populations to terrorize. The enemy was now a conventional army. The tools of repression, mass executions, village burnings, indiscriminate killing, were useless against tanks, artillery, and coordinated infantry assaults. The brigade was out of its element. In early 1945, remnants of the unit were incorporated into increasingly desperate defensive formations. Some elements were redesignated as the 36th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, an attempt to grant legitimacy and structure to what remained. In reality, this reorganization existed largely on paper. The division was severely understrength. Equipment shortages were extreme. Training was minimal. Many recruits were unfit for combat, drawn from prisons, forced conscripts, or other depleted units. Cohesion was almost non-existent. Oskar Dirlewanger himself was no longer able to maintain control. Years of unchecked authority had not produced a capable commander. Dirlewanger's leadership style, based on intimidation and indulgence of brutality, failed in a context requiring discipline and coordination. His health deteriorated. He was wounded multiple times. His grip on the unit weakened. As Soviet forces pushed deeper into German territory, the brigade retreated in disorder. Withdrawals were often chaotic. Units abandoned positions without orders. Equipment was discarded. Communications broke down. Some elements engaged in continued violence against civilians even during retreat, looting and killing in areas that were about to fall to the enemy. These acts served no military purpose. They reflected a unit incapable of adapting to changing circumstances. Violence had become reflexive rather than strategic. The collapse of command removed even the pretense of control. German civilians increasingly came into contact with the brigade. The results were predictable. Looting, abuse, and killings occurred in areas the unit passed through. The distinction between occupier and defender dissolved. The brigade treated German civilians with the same contempt it had shown occupied populations, underscoring the moral vacuum at its core. By April 1945, the Third Reich was disintegrating. Berlin was encircled. Supply lines had collapsed. Command structures were paralyzed. Orders issued from Berlin were disconnected from reality. Units were left to fend for themselves. The Dirlewanger formation effectively ceased to function as a coherent unit. Some elements attempted to surrender to Western Allied forces. Others fled eastward, hoping to avoid Soviet capture. Small groups broke off entirely, disappearing into the chaos of collapsing Germany. Oskar Dirlewanger himself attempted to escape accountability. After being wounded again, he was captured by French forces. Stripped of his authority and isolated from the protection of the SS hierarchy, Dirlewanger was now vulnerable in a way he had never been before. The brigade he created no longer existed. What remained was a trail of destruction stretching from the forests of Belarus to the ruins of Warsaw and into the heart of Germany. The unit's collapse mirrored the collapse of the regime that had created it, a system that embraced criminality as policy and violence as ideology. In its final weeks, the Dirlewanger formation contributed nothing meaningful to Germany's defense. It delayed no offensives. It held no decisive ground. It achieved no strategic objectives. Its presence on the battlefield was largely irrelevant, except as a source of disorder and further suffering. This outcome was inevitable. A unit built on terror cannot function as a conventional fighting force. Criminality may be weaponized against the defenseless, but it cannot replace discipline, cohesion, or leadership when faced with a capable enemy. The collapse of the Dirlewanger Brigade exposed the hollowness of Nazi claims about strength and resolve. Behind the rhetoric of racial superiority and iron discipline lay a system that relied on coercion, fear, and destruction. When that system was forced into open conflict against organized resistance, it failed catastrophically. The final reckoning, however, was still to come. The end of the war would bring questions of accountability, justice, and memory. The fate of Oskar Dirlewanger and his men would reflect the uneven and often incomplete process of reckoning with one of the darkest chapters of the conflict. That reckoning, and what it reveals about how history confronts organized atrocity, forms the final part of this story. The end of the Second World War brought the collapse of the Nazi regime, but it did not bring closure for many of its victims. Across Europe, survivors emerged from ruins, camps, and mass graves, carrying memories of violence that would shape post-war generations. Among the perpetrators, some were captured and prosecuted, others disappeared into obscurity, and many were never held to account. The fate of Oskar Dirlewanger sits uneasily within this post-war landscape. By the spring of 1945, Dirlewanger was no longer the protected figure he had once been. The SS hierarchy that had shielded him was disintegrating. Heinrich Himmler fled and later died by suicide. Command structures collapsed. Personal connections that once ensured immunity were now meaningless. Dirlewanger himself was wounded during the final fighting in Germany. Accounts vary regarding the exact circumstances of his capture, but by May 1945 he was in Allied custody. He was held by French forces in a detention facility in southern Germany. For the first time in years, he was isolated from subordinates and stripped of authority. His reputation preceded him. French guards were aware of his role in atrocities committed across Eastern Europe and Poland. Survivors and local populations had already begun identifying known perpetrators. Dirlewanger was no longer protected by secrecy or ideology. Within days, he was dead. Official records describe his death as resulting from mistreatment while in custody. Multiple accounts suggest he was beaten repeatedly by guards or possibly by former prisoners who recognized him. There was no formal trial, no sentencing, and no public reckoning. His death was violent, abrupt, and extrajudicial. For many, this outcome felt unsatisfying. Dirlewanger had overseen and encouraged mass murder on an enormous scale. His death prevented a detailed judicial examination of his actions. There would be no courtroom testimony, no cross-examination, no official verdict that documented his crimes in full. Yet his end also reflected the chaotic reality of post-war Europe. Legal systems were overwhelmed. Millions were displaced. Evidence was scattered or destroyed. Many perpetrators blended into civilian populations, or were shielded by Cold War priorities that quickly shifted focus away from accountability. The Dirlewanger Brigade itself effectively vanished. Some of its members were killed in combat or captured by Soviet forces, where survival was unlikely. Others were imprisoned by Allied authorities. A number managed to evade identification entirely, returning to civilian life under false or incomplete records. Prosecutions were uneven. A handful of former members faced trials in Eastern Europe or Germany, often for specific crimes committed in identifiable locations. Sentences varied widely. Some were executed. Others received prison terms. Many were never charged at all. This inconsistency reflected a broader problem. For survivors, justice was partial at best. In Belarus, Poland, and other affected regions, entire villages had been erased. Family lines ended. Oral histories survived where documentation did not. Many survivors lived under new political regimes that discouraged or reshaped discussion of wartime experiences. The Warsaw Uprising became a central symbol of Polish suffering and resistance. Within this narrative, the crimes of the Dirlewanger Brigade were remembered as part of a larger campaign of destruction. Survivor testimonies described unimaginable violence, but for decades these accounts struggled to gain international recognition amid Cold War politics and competing historical narratives. In Belarus, the devastation of rural regions remained visible long after the war. Memorials marked mass graves. Burned villages were commemorated as symbols of collective suffering. The role of specific units was often secondary to the scale of loss. For many, the distinction between perpetrators mattered less than the fact that entire communities had been destroyed. Over time, historians began reconstructing the record. Through archival research, trial transcripts, military reports, and survivor testimonies, scholars pieced together the history of the Dirlewanger Brigade. What emerged was a picture not of a rogue anomaly, but of a unit that functioned exactly as intended within a system that embraced terror as policy. This distinction is crucial. The Dirlewanger Brigade was not an accident. It was not the product of one man's pathology alone. It was authorized, supplied, and protected by the Nazi state. Its crimes were enabled by ideology, bureaucracy, and command decisions that rewarded brutality. Understanding this prevents convenient scapegoating. Focusing solely on Dirlewanger as a uniquely monstrous individual risks obscuring the broader system that empowered him. His behavior was extreme, but it was tolerated and even encouraged because it aligned with regime objectives. This realization complicates post-war narratives. It challenges attempts to isolate evil within a few individuals while preserving the illusion of institutional innocence. The Dirlewanger Brigade exposes how quickly criminality can become normalized when moral constraints are removed and violence is reframed as duty. In public memory, the unit occupies a grim place. It is often described as the worst SS formation, a label that reflects the scale and intensity of its crimes. Yet historians caution against ranking atrocity. The purpose of studying such units is not comparison, but understanding. The true lesson lies in how such a unit became possible. It emerged from ideological dehumanization, administrative convenience, and the erosion of legal norms. It thrived in environments where accountability was absent and results were measured in destruction rather than stability. Its collapse illustrates the limits of terror. When removed from contexts where violence could be inflicted without resistance, the unit failed. Against organized armies, its criminal culture proved useless. Its disintegration mirrored the collapse of the regime that created it. For modern audiences, this history carries uncomfortable implications. It demonstrates that extreme violence does not require uniquely evil societies. It requires systems that reward obedience over conscience and efficiency over humanity. The men of the Dirlewanger Brigade were not mythical monsters. They were products of a political and institutional environment that stripped away restraint. Remembering this history is not about fascination. It is about responsibility, about recognizing how easily boundaries can erode when ideology overrides ethics and fear replaces law, about understanding that the worst crimes often occur not in secrecy, but in plain sight, justified by language that disguises murder as necessity. The victims of the Dirlewanger Brigade rarely received justice. Their villages were not rebuilt. Their families were not restored. Their stories survived unevenly, carried forward by memory rather than verdicts. History cannot undo that loss. What it can do is refuse to forget. By documenting units like the Dirlewanger Brigade honestly and critically, historians confront the mechanisms of mass violence rather than reducing them to sensationalism. This approach honors victims not through spectacle, but through clarity. The legacy of the Dirlewanger Brigade is not one of military significance. It is a warning about what happens when criminality is institutionalized, when ideology erases empathy, and when violence becomes policy rather than failure. In examining this unit, we are not studying an outlier. We are studying the logical extreme of a system that abandoned humanity entirely, and the devastation that followed.